Hello! Been thinking about progressive metal lately and how there's a lot of good bands that fly under the radar or otherwise lost to obscurity. I wanted to go over 5 random prog metal albums from the 90s that don't get a lot of attention. This is strictly prog metal. Obviously, there's a lot of thrash albums from the early 90s that came pretty close to prog metal, untold of amount of uh, 90s death metal that comes close as well. But this list is focusing strictly on albums that don't really flirt with any of the more extreme elements of metal. At some point, I'd like to do some videos covering that stuff as well. Now, prog metal has been divided into a few different schools of thought. For me, the best progressive metal has its roots in 70s bands like Rush and 80s heavy metal music as well. Hey, call me a boomer, but yeah. So basically, that means you get really talented vocalists with a lot of range, high pitched vocalists that, some might call cheesy if they're uneducated. You get dynamics, melody, good sense of drama without any self conscious irony or forced zaniness. Usually have a good production style too, where the instruments are separated instead of just a wall of noise where everybody's got 15 strings on their guitar, 15 strings on their bass, and you can't even hear the bass because it's brick wall. So this video is more for the people who are already into bands like Queensryche, Fate's Warning with both vocalists, Crimson Glory, people who prefer the Kevin Moore era of Dream Theater more than, say, Octavarium or something like that. So now that I've alienated anyone younger than 40, the first band I want to talk about is Kingsbane from Toronto. All right, so their 1991 demo is awesome. You can tell from the cover what you're going to get, kind of heavy John Arch influence in the vocals, some similarities to James LaBrie when he was actually good, which is interesting because in 1991 nobody knew who James LaBrie was yet, and unless these guys had the Winter Rose album. But bass and drums really pop. I mean, you can tell these guys probably studied the production style of Terry Brown. Solid heavy metal elements to it. There's not any keyboards, but it almost sounds like there should be, and I mean that in a good way. Stylistically, has its foot in the 80s, but also sounds strangely modern and forward thinking, as in you can definitely see similarities with bands like Dream Theater. Now, 4 years later, Kingsbane changed their name to the far less cool In the Name and released a self-titled full length in '95 that was pretty much dead in the water. You can see a lot of stylistic growth between Kingsbane and In the Name. In the Name's album is a bit too long for its own good, but you can hear they're clearly into the Dream Theater Awake album, even though still no keyboards on this one, as well as mixing in the modernity of stuff like you can almost hear some King's X, a little bit of Galactic Cowboys on some level. There's even some parts of this album that I could see being influenced almost by Faith No More, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. Basically, the way Dream Theater will also mixing in these newer outside influences alongside their '80s influences as well. But it's still got some of that '80s prog metal in it as well. I do prefer the '91 Kingsbane demo because that one's just like killer heavy metal. Even if you're not that into prog metal, I think you might enjoy it if you're into '80s metal at least. But I do recommend both. Next on the list is Lethal from Kentucky with their 1990 album Programmed. It's basically Queensryche, Crimson Glory worship on some level. Great, catchy songs. Musically, it's hard to even consider it a '90s album, but I wanted to talk about it anyway just because no one really mentions it. Strong power metal elements here, almost reminiscent of bands like Sanctuary, Liege Lord, maybe Riot's Thundersteel album, although this is way more in like serious Queensryche territory. It sounds a lot more pensive and reflective than something like Riot Thundersteel. It's definitely better than anything Queensryche did after Operation Mindcrime, so I recommend checking it out for sure. That's another one that would appeal to just straight heavy metal fans, I believe. Even if you hate Dream Theater and if you hate Odd Time Signatures, you'd still probably dig Lethal. All right, that's not the case for this one. Next one is Soul Cages from Germany. All right, now Germany never had a shortage of prog metal and power metal stuff. Really, they're a country that kept traditional heavy metal alive throughout the '90s. And I mean, they've been a hotbed for this sort of prog metal thing back to the days of Mekong Delta, Scanner, Death Row, countless others, man. Soul Cages is more stylistically firmly in the '90s for sure. This is the type of progressive metal you couldn't really imagine existing in a world without images and words and Awake. A lot of mid-pace, sort of reflective sounding music here, but it's not straight Dream Theater worship like some of the other forgotten German bands like Hydrotoxin with their Oceans album. Uh, Soul Cage's self-titled '94 album and their '96 album Moments, both worth a mention. I do prefer the debut. Strong Rush elements, Queensryche elements, but big Dream Theater elements as well. Most of the actual metal aspects are fairly subdued, except when there are these really grand, majestic moments. It's kind of epic, moody atmosphere. It's moody, atmospheric music without crossing into that standard '90s angst that I don't enjoy. The keyboards are very subtle and out in your face. There's even a woman on backing vocals who's often like singing in unison with the operatic sort of lead male vocalist, who basically sounds like a German James LaBrie. And I mean, sounds like it'd be totally cornball, but it just works. There's a great snare sound on the records because it's kind of like Portnoy on Awake. Check out the song Actors of No Return from the first album. There's a lot of diverse segments to it, but it's all tasteful. It actually has some kind of emotionally moving qualities to it. Female backing vocalist almost has this fucking like Cocteau Twins level tranquility to her voice, which you don't expect in any sort of progressive metal or metal at all. Definitely worth checking out if you like things that are melodic, atmospheric, sometimes grandiose. And the music is not super over the top technical either. I mean, it's definitely technical, but it's not like they're cramming in a ton of notes. And now the last one I'm going to go over is another, even weirder record from Germany, the band Paynes Gray with their album Kadath Decoded. Honestly, this is pretty far removed from any sort of '80s heavy metal undercurrent. It sounds more like if '90s Fates Warning or Dream Theater started embracing more pastoral acoustic influences like Genesis, Renaissance. Um, the theatricality of this stuff is closer in nature to something like fucking Gentle Giant than it is Iron Maiden, basically. I mean, there's even the occasional kind of Latin tinge, Al Di Meola type acoustic part. Really not much out there that sounds like this in the metal world at all. Probably why these guys vanished without a trace after this record. It takes a while to even figure out you're listening to kind of a metal record. And when the song Cavern of Flame kicks in, it's almost jarring at first because you're like, oh shit, I thought this was a fucking '70s prog record. Even then, the way these guys present metal is more in the atmosphere and the sinister nature of the keyboards. For what's on the surface of kind of, seems like a busy and convoluted kind of conceptual prog metal record, there's actually a ton of open space and atmospheric, almost dreamlike sequences. So I definitely think it's worth checking out. This one might test the patience of even diehard prog metal freaks, but I think it's killer. All right, so there you have it. 5, kind of 6 random gems of '90s progressive metal for the true heads out there. Obviously, there's a million more of these I could do. There's even a few I'm thinking of right now that I wish I had talked about, but I'm getting tired of talking. So you can expect some more videos on this topic. Like I said earlier, I'm also planning on doing some videos on the techier, proggier side of death metal in the '90s, and not just talking about Atheist and Cynic for the 20 billionth time. I'm talking about more obscure bands like Embryonic Death and Violent Dirge, and I might even throw in the progressive leaning thrash stuff because there's a ton of that stuff that gets ignored. Anyway, what are your thoughts on the video? Don't forget to subscribe, check out these records, recommend more records. You know the drill. And thank you.